During my dad's birthday party, my sister whispered, "Don't eat the cake." I asked why. She said, "It's just a gut feeling, okay?" Even now, I can still see her face. Her eyes locked on the cake like it was a loaded gun sitting on the table. It wasn't panic exactly. More like she'd already weighed the cost of speaking up and decided to keep most of it to herself. At the time, I thought she was just being weird. I didn't know that her gut feeling was about to decide whether my parents survived. The night before had been chaos, Dad's 58th birthday in full swing. His house was packed with old friends, work contacts, and a few unfamiliar faces. People were laughing too loudly, shaking his hand, congratulating him on another year young. There were speeches, clinking glasses, and a mountain of gifts piled on the dining room table. Somewhere in the middle of all that, someone had delivered a pristine white bakery box, tied with a red ribbon. No card, no fanfare, just a quick drop-off and gone again. I didn't even notice it until later. Tonight was the opposite. Just me, Claire, Mom, and Dad. No loud voices, no background music, just the quiet hum of the fridge and the faint scrape of chairs as we sat down. The bakery box sat in the middle of the table like a centerpiece, untouched since last night. "Let's finally cut into that," Mom said, reaching for a knife. Claire's voice came so suddenly, so low, it barely registered at first. "Don't eat the cake." I turned to her. "What?" Her eyes didn't leave the box. "It's just a gut feeling, okay?" I stared at her, waiting for more. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, like she was warning me not to push it. Her tone wasn't dramatic, but there was a finality to it, the kind you only use when you've already made your decision. I almost said something, teased her for being paranoid maybe, but truthfully I wasn't in the mood for sweets anyway. Dinner had been heavy, and I could still feel the weight of the food in my stomach. So, I leaned back in my chair and let it go. Dad, on the other hand, didn't. He cut a generous slice for himself and another for Mom, the knife slicing through the frosting with a soft hiss. They each took a forkful. Claire didn't move. Neither did I. We lingered over the table for another hour, talking about nothing in particular. Dad mentioned some new contract he was excited about, and Mom was planning a weekend away. Eventually, I helped carry the plates into the kitchen and started loading the dishwasher. Claire stayed in her seat, arms crossed, eyes somewhere far away. It was just after 10 when I noticed Mom was quieter than usual. She was leaning into the couch cushions, hand pressed to her stomach. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead. Dad was next. One minute he was telling me about a supplier he'd been dealing with, the next he was grimacing, his jaw tight. By 10:30, both of them were bent over, groaning. Mom excused herself to the bathroom, and Dad barely made it to the armchair before sinking down like his bones had given up. Claire stood up. Not rushed, not frantic. Just with this grim certainty, like she'd been waiting for the moment. She took her phone out, dialed, and pressed it to her ear. "This is 911, she said. "I need an ambulance at 418 Westbrook Lane. 2 adults, severe abdominal pain, onset less than an hour ago. Yes, they're conscious. No, they haven't lost consciousness yet." I stared at her. "Claire, what the hell?" She held up a hand to silence me, still listening to the dispatcher. The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens breaking the stillness of the street. The paramedics moved fast, blood pressure, oxygen levels, questions I couldn't process in real time. They loaded Mom and Dad onto stretchers, both looking too weak to argue. Claire rode with them in the ambulance. I followed in my car, headlights cutting through the dark, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. My mind kept replaying her whisper at the table. "Don't eat the cake." At the hospital, the emergency room swallowed us in its sterile brightness. Nurses moved around with quiet urgency, hooking for lines, drawing blood. A doctor in a white coat approached after what felt like forever. "It's poisoning," he said, voice clinical but edged with gravity. "They're stable now, but if they hadn't been brought in so quickly." He didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. I turned to Claire. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shocked. She was steady, like she'd known this was coming. The fluorescent hospital lights made everything look washed out, like the world had been drained of color overnight. My parents were stable, but I still hadn't gotten an answer from Claire. I found her standing by the vending machines, hands wrapped around a coffee she wasn't drinking. I stepped up beside her. You want to tell me what the hell that was about? Her gaze stayed on the black surface of the coffee. You didn't eat the cake. That's not an answer. My voice was sharper than I intended. Claire, you knew. You knew something was going to happen. You don't get to just. She finally looked up at me. There was no fear in her expression, just a kind of grim resignation. I work for Marcus Hale. The name landed like a punch. Marcus. I stared at her, half expecting her to smirk and say she was joking. But she didn't. Dad's Marcus? Our Uncle Marcus. She shook her head slightly. I'm not his niece. Not to him. At work, I'm Claire Reynolds. My married name. No one there knows I'm a Hale. Not even him. I blinked, struggling to process that. You've been working for him all this time? 2 years. She sipped her coffee, winced at the taste, and set it down untouched on the vending machine. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I needed the job, the pay was good, and he's not exactly in the office much. I thought I could keep my head down and stay invisible. Until last night? Her jaw tightened. Until 2 days ago. She leaned back against the wall, and her voice dropped lower, like she was afraid the hospital walls might have ears. I was in the hallway outside Marcus's office, sorting some files, when I heard him yelling. He'd just gotten word that Dad's company landed a government contract he'd been chasing for months. I heard him tell someone they needed to clear the board before the quarter ends. I frowned. That could mean anything. It didn't sound like a business metaphor. She didn't blink. He was calm by the end. Too calm. Like he'd made a decision. The memory seemed to pull her inward for a moment before she went on. I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof. And Marcus doesn't bluff. If one plan fails, he'll try another. I didn't want to tip him off and give him time to come up with something worse. I thought about Dad's stories over the years, always dismissive when Marcus's name came up. He'd said once that they stopped speaking after their father's will was read. Dad got the family home and seed money for his business. Marcus got a smaller share and a lingering grudge. That grudge had grown over 20 years into open hostility. You realize you're telling me you let them eat poison just to see if your hunch was right? My voice cracked on the last word. Her eyes hardened. No. I recognized the delivery guy last night. That's when I knew. I thought back to the cake arriving during the bigger party. A man in a dark suit, clean-cut, polite. I barely noticed him. Who was he? Carl Benson, she said without hesitation. One of Marcus's senior managers. He's been with him since the early days. If Marcus wanted something done quietly, Carl would do it. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. This one entirely separate from the hospital air. The cake. The perfect presentation. The casual way Dad had sliced into it. Claire's voice cut through my thoughts. I didn't eat because I knew Carl's face. You didn't eat because you listened to me. But Mom and Dad. Her eyes flicked toward their room. If the ambulance had been 5 minutes later, I didn't let her finish. The image was too close to reality already. By the time morning came, the hospital smell was burned into my clothes. Claire and I sat in the parking lot, watching the sun edge over the horizon. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew the next step. I broke the silence first. We go to the police before we tell Dad anything. Claire nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her. If we go to him now, he'll storm over to Marcus's office himself. The drive to the precinct was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you overthink every single choice that got you here. By the time we stepped into the lobby, I'd rehearsed the conversation in my head a dozen times, and none of those versions matched how it actually began. Detective Harris was already at her desk, flipping through a stack of case files. She looked up as we approached, her eyes narrowing slightly like she was trying to place me. Ryan Hale, she said slowly. And Claire Reynolds. Claire gave a polite nod. You're Daniel Hale's kids, Harris said, motioning us to sit. What's this about? I hesitated for half a second, then went all in. It's about Marcus Hale. Her eyebrows lifted, just enough to register interest, but not surprise. What about him? He tried to kill our parents last night, Claire said, her tone calm but cutting. Harris leaned back in her chair, studying us. That's a serious accusation. You have proof? Claire shook her head. Not yet. But I work for him. Under my married name. He doesn't know I'm family. 2 days ago, I overheard him telling one of his managers to clear the board. Last night, that same manager delivered a cake to my dad's birthday party. My parents ate it. Hours later, they were in the ER with confirmed poisoning. Harris didn't move for a moment. Then she pulled a yellow legal pad closer and started jotting notes. Marcus Hale has been on my radar for years. Financial crimes, intimidation, and possible contract hits. But nothing's ever stuck. Not because we couldn't find dirt, but because he's very, very good at covering his tracks. Claire leaned forward. So you believe us? I believe he's capable of it, Harris said, tapping her pen against the pad. But that's not enough to make a case. If I go at him with nothing but this conversation, he'll walk. And he'll know someone inside his operation is feeding me information. So what do we do? I asked. Harris studied Claire for a moment. You stay in place. Keep doing your job like nothing happened. But you start paying attention to everything, names, dates, offhand comments. If he moves something big, I want to know. That's not going to be easy, Claire said. Harris smirked faintly. If it were easy, I'd have nailed him years ago. Marcus is manipulative, patient. He'll let things simmer for months if it serves him. You can't rush him. But if you're in his orbit, you'll see the ripples before anyone else. She turned to me. You stay close to your sister. Support her, but don't get sloppy. And don't talk to your parents about this, not yet. If Marcus thinks they know, he'll panic. I hated the idea of keeping Dad in the dark. But Harris was right. The more he knew, the harder it would be to stop him from acting on it. Harris reached into her desk and slid something across to me. A cheap, black burner phone. This is for updates. Nothing else. If you find something, you call or text this number. If you feel like you're being followed, you turn the phone off and ditch it. I'll know what that means. I took it, the weight of it heavier than it had any right to be. And what if Marcus figures out we're looking into him? Then, Harris said, her expression flat, you disappear for a while, and you let me worry about Marcus Hale. The ride back from the station felt different. Like we'd crossed an invisible line and there was no going back. Claire sat with her arms folded, staring out the window, her reflection pale against the glass. You sure about this? I asked finally. She didn't look at me. If we do nothing, he wins. And he's already taken enough from this family. I didn't have a good answer for that. For the next 2 weeks, my life became a split screen. One side pretending everything was fine at family dinners. The other passing quiet updates to Harris from my car in dark parking lots. It was exhausting, trying to smile for Dad while knowing the man who tried to poison him was still out there. Still moving pieces we couldn't fully see. Claire had the harder role. Every morning, she walked into Marcus's building, nodded to his assistants, and took her seat like she didn't know exactly what he'd tried to do. She said the trick was acting like she was too busy to care about anything outside her immediate workload. People underestimate the quiet ones, she told me. It made her invisible, which is exactly what she needed to be. Her reports came in bursts, sometimes nothing for days, then a sudden call with a detail that made my chest tighten. The first one was about an unusual meeting. Marcus in his office with 2 men she didn't recognize. One was wearing a construction company jacket. The other looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom. She caught a few words as she passed the door. Shipment, dock numbers. No mistakes this time. Meanwhile, I had my eyes on our side of the board. At Daniel's company, I kept my ears open for anything odd. Packages arriving without return addresses. Courier deliveries that bypassed the front desk. Phone calls from blocked numbers that hung up when anyone but Daniel answered. Twice, I caught a man I'd never seen before lingering across the street, pretending to check his phone while watching the building. I memorized his face, passed it on to Harris. The breakthrough came from Janet, our parents' next-door neighbor. Janet is one of those people who notices everything without even trying. The kind who can tell you which garbage cans went out late on Tuesday night and whose dog walker is new. She called me one evening to say she'd seen an unfamiliar black SUV parked near Marcus's office after hours. 3 nights in a row. The driver never got out, but someone else did. A man who slipped in through the side door and stayed for less than 20 minutes. I gave the plate number to Harris. 2 days later, she called me back. The SUV was registered to a holding company with a paper trail that eventually led to one name. Alan Vick, a fixer Harris had been trying to nail for almost a decade. Vic was the kind of man you called when you didn't want something traced back to you. If he was meeting Marcus in the dead of night, it wasn't about taxes. The pile of evidence was starting to look like something. Not enough to bring charges yet, but enough to draw the outline of what Marcus was doing. Harris said we had to be patient, keep tightening the noose. She warned us more than once that Marcus wouldn't sit still forever. If he even suspected someone was feeding the cops, he'd change his playbook overnight. That warning stuck with me. Every time Claire went to work, I found myself watching the clock, waiting for her to text that she'd made it home. She brushed it off when I mentioned it, said fear was exactly what Marcus wanted. Maybe she was right, but fear is easier to swallow when it's just yours, not when it's wrapped around the only person keeping your parents safe. Still, we played along. Claire smiled in meetings, laughed at Marcus's occasional jokes, and nodded when he talked about tightening operations. I waved to my parents like everything was fine, took calls from Harris in parking garages, and wrote down every single thing that didn't feel right. And the more we gathered, the more I realized we weren't just fighting to prove what Marcus had done. We were racing to stop whatever he was planning next. It was a crisp Thursday morning when Harris's name flashed on my phone. She didn't waste words. Today. That one word sent a current straight through me. No preamble, no explanation. Just the signal we'd been waiting for. Claire had left early for work as usual, armed with nothing but her composure and a stack of client reports. I didn't tell her the details. Harris had insisted on minimizing chatter in case Marcus caught even a whiff of suspicion. By the time I pulled into the lot across from Marcus's building, the operation was already in motion. Unmarked sedans lined the curb. Officers in plain clothes loitered near the entrance like they belonged there. Harris stood on the sidewalk, coffee in one hand, a manila folder in the other. "He's upstairs," she said, nodding toward the mirrored glass facade. Conference room, completely unaware. The plan was surgical. Get Marcus contained in his meeting while another team swept his office. No grand scenes in front of employees if they could help it. No warning shots that would let anyone shred documents or wipe hard drives. Upstairs, two detectives in blazers moved past reception like they'd been coming there for years. Down the hall, the door to Marcus's office opened, and the quiet invasion began. One officer carried a heavy-duty evidence case. Another was already sliding on gloves. Files came first, thick binders from the credenza behind his desk, manila envelopes from the locked bottom drawer. Then the techs moved in, disconnecting a desktop tower, sweeping the shelves for USB drives and external hard disks. Every cable, every scrap of paper went into labeled evidence bags. I caught Harris's eye when she pulled a thin blue folder from the middle drawer and flipped it open. Inside were payment records, clean, precise entries masked as consulting fees to a private account in another state. The account holder's name made my stomach knot. It was the same man who'd delivered the cake. "Got him?" Harris murmured, tucking the folder into her case. Meanwhile, Claire was executing her part of the plan. She'd been called into HR under the pretense of reviewing a confidential client matter. The officer waiting in the HR manager's office was dressed in a crisp suit, looking for all the world like another corporate compliance consultant. When he asked her to step out for a security escort, she followed without question. She told me later she didn't let herself breathe until they were outside. Only when she was safely away did Harris give the nod to the arrest team. Marcus was still talking when they walked into the conference room. At first, he didn't even look up. Then the silence around him registered, and his words faltered. The lead detective read the charges in a steady voice. Conspiracy, attempted murder, corporate sabotage. I wish I could say he exploded, denied everything, and made a scene. But Marcus Hale just sat back in his chair, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes flicking from one badge to the next like he was memorizing them for later. It wasn't until they mentioned Claire's role that something broke. His gaze sharpened, and for the first time, I saw something raw behind it. Not guilt, but recognition. "My niece," he said, almost to himself. They didn't answer. The cuffs clicked, the room emptied, and Marcus Hale, the man who tried to erase my father from the board entirely, was walked out through the same lobby where his employees used to nod to him with respect. The fallout was immediate. News crews were tipped before Marcus even reached booking. By the time the story hit the evening broadcasts, his face was plastered across the screen alongside words like poisoning plot and corporate conspiracy. And he wasn't alone. Two of his top executives, both of whom had been in those late-night meetings Claire had reported, were arrested within hours. They faced the same charges, plus additional counts for fraud and racketeering. When Claire finally called me that night, her voice was steady but drained. "It's done," she said. 2 weeks later, Dad and Mom were back home, thinner but recovering. The house was quieter. No phones ringing, no business chatter. Just the sound of him trying to breathe normally again. Dad sat in his chair by the window like he always had, but now there was a blanket over his knees and a tray of bland food on the side table. Sunlight fell across the living room in pale bands, catching on the dust we never used to notice. Mom dozed on the couch with a book face down on her chest, the edges of her hospital wristband still ghosting her skin. Claire and I moved around the room like stagehands, tidying, making tea, trying not to crowd him. "Thanks for being here," Dad said, voice roughened by 2 hard weeks. He didn't look at me when he said it. He watched the light instead, as if the right words might be hiding in it. I don't think I'd have made it through that first night without you." I nodded. "You don't have to say anything." But he did, because silence had always been a way we let things slide, and nothing about this could slide anymore. He reached for the mug, hand trembling, and took a sip that seemed to exhaust him. Behind us, the old wall clock ticked without mercy. A soft knock broke the stillness. When I opened the door, Detective Harris stood on the porch in a dark coat, hair pulled back, a folder tucked under one arm. She stepped inside with the professional gentleness of someone used to entering rooms like ours. "Mr. Hale," she said, inclining her head toward Dad. Dad straightened as much as he could. "You have news." "I do." Harris set the folder on the coffee table but kept a hand on it, as if anchoring what was inside. "The DA is moving forward. Your brother will be tried on multiple counts. Conspiracy, attempted murder, and several financial crimes tied to the sabotage. We also have 3 other complainants, former business partners of Marcus, willing to testify to similar patterns. It won't be quick, but the case is strong." Mom's eyes filled, equal parts relief and hurt. Dad just stared at the folder, jaw tight, like he could grind down what it meant by sheer will. "He's still my brother," he said, almost to himself. Harris didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, but he's also the man who did this." Her gaze slid to the tray of uneaten food, the blanket, the paleness of Mom's hands. "We'll keep you updated on every step. Today was about making sure you know you're not waiting in the dark." She gave us space after that, a few procedural notes, a direct number for victim services, then left as quietly as she'd come. The door clicked shut behind her, and the house went still again like it was listening. Claire was the one who broke the silence. She stepped closer to Dad's chair, folding and unfolding her fingers until she stilled them by force. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "All of it, not pieces." Dad looked at her, like a man realizing he'd been reading a book by the wrong light. "Go on, sweetheart." She told him everything. How she took the job under her married name. How she kept her head down for 2 years, not because she was complicit, but because she wanted eyes on what he was doing. How she overheard Marcus 2 days before the party, the phrase that wouldn't leave her, "clear the board," and the way it wasn't a metaphor. How she recognized Carl Benson when the cake arrived. How she warned me instead of making a scene because she was sure it would tip him off and make whatever came next even worse. She told him about the station, about Harris, about the burner phone and the late-night check-ins from dim parking lots. About sitting at her desk pretending to care about expense reports while watching men in suit coats slip into Marcus's office through the side door. About the fear that came in sharp, private flashes, and the certainty that doing nothing would be worse. Dad listened without interruption. At some point, Mom sat up and took his hand. Claire's voice shook once, then steadied. When she finished, the room stayed quiet long enough for the clock to mark 20 more seconds of our lives. Dad's face went through a weather system. Disbelief, anger, horror, something like grief. Then the hollowed-out look of a man taking stock of what can't be made right. He pressed his fingertips to his brow as if to hold it all in place. "My own brother," he said softly. "Over a contract. Over money." "It was never just money," I said. "It was control. Winning. Making you vanish." He nodded, a muscle in his jaw working. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "I should have seen it coming. No, Claire said, stepping closer, her voice firm. He made sure you wouldn't. That's what he does. Dad's gaze moved between us, and for a moment, I saw the father from before the hospital rooms and poison, before the long silence between him and Marcus calcified into something deadly. Then he exhaled and reached for Claire's hand. She took it, and he pulled her close with a tired, grateful awkwardness that undid me more than anything else that day. He turned to me next. And you, he said, you were there. Yeah, I said, because the rest, the calls, the license plates, the sleepless nights, didn't need to be cataloged to count. We were in it together. We sat like that for a while. The four of us in a room that finally felt like ours again, even with all the broken edges showing. Outside, a delivery truck rattled by. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked and then thought better of it. Normal sounds, still somehow strange. That evening, Dad woke and asked for tea. His voice was stronger. When I brought the mug, he took it with both hands and looked up at me the way he used to when I was a kid bringing him a screwdriver he didn't actually need. We'll be all right, he said, and I believed him. Not because everything was fixed, but because we'd seen what was broken and faced it anyway. We cleaned the kitchen together, slow and easy. The clock ticked. The house breathed. And in that quiet, I understood the math of what had happened. One warning, one refusal. One night that split our family open and showed us what we were made of. What would you have done if your own uncle tried to kill your dad, and your sister was the only one who could stop him? Think Claire should have told our father sooner, or did she time it right? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more wild betrayal stories like this, stick around for the next one.